Hi everyone, this is Kristen Newton, Marketing Director at PMR, and you're listening to our podcast, The Blue Table Talk. On today's episode, I will be joined by my colleagues, Cliff Hope and Ryan Carafiello, where we will be discussing the facts of refining. The purpose of this talk is to illuminate the terms that recyclers will be exposed to when refining their converters, as well as detail the realities of this process over the course of time. If you're currently lacking information on what it means to deal direct and work with a toll refiner, this is the podcast for you. With that said, let us begin. Right, welcome to today's Blue Table Talk. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Ryan Carafiello and Cliff Hope. Today we are going to be talking about the facts of refining. So I just like to begin with a little description or defining the concept of refining terms. Ryan, Cliff, one of you want to go ahead and explain that?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about toll refining, what we're doing here is we're taking material and bringing it into a laboratory to assess it for its value as it will eventually become precious metal ounces. So in the beginning, toll refining refers to almost like having material coming out of the ground. So the mine that would bring out platinum, palladium, and rhodium. In this case, it's converters, and they're similarly not actual precious metal ounces until they have been toll refined. And that means a very long process where we are harvesting the converters, processing them, doing an assay, understanding what's going to come from those converters at the assay point, and then subsequently passing that down the road to a chemical refiner for eventual delivery as physical precious metal ounces.
Thank you, Cliff. Ryan, I'd like you to just, to build upon Cliff's point, can you just describe what is included in refining terms in terms of what our suppliers going to be looking at on a typical term sheet?
Okay, I would say typical or standard term sheet, you're going to probably start with your metal returns in a percentage back of platinum, palladium, rhodium. Definitely, you're going to probably see some sort of treatment charge. Some companies call it a treatment charge. Others call it, a decanning fee, or there's other terms from it. You might have a metal fee or a sponge fee, basically paid charged back on how many returnable ounces come out of that load. You're usually going to see an interest rate some way or another on that term agreement as well. What else? Am I missing anything, Cliff?
I don't think so. I think one of the commonly asked questions that I get about terms, especially around interest rates, is when an interest rate is applied, at what stage of the process.
Yeah.
So most companies that are selling catalytic converters based on toll refining are looking for money from that material relatively quickly. And as we're talking about a commodity that is being transformed from essentially being in the ground to becoming a pure precious metal ounce, the timing in that typically takes 115 to 120 days. So without the final process or the deliverable material being, we're going to say physical, the in-between time is a place where companies want to get paid early, and there's a cost to that. There has to be a financing cost to that money being given out prior to the delivery. And this is where an interest rate is going to come into play, so that companies get paid faster for their material based on the toll refining model, so that they don't have to wait the entire contract time for it to become physical.
So in a brief summary, Ryan spoke about metal returns in terms of a percentage, treatment charges, also known as decanning charges, metal fees. Cliff went into interest rates, as well as, and you didn't directly say it, but contract time, right? These are the typical things you'll see on a terms agreement. And I would go one step further to say there would even be sometimes fees associated to material types, right? Like DPF. If you could just, I know that you briefly touched upon it. Can you just explain in a little more detail what you meant by metal sponge fee? Because I think some people don't understand that, and I think it would be great if you just elaborated on that a bit.
Yeah. So basically, after the returnable, you figure out the returnable ounces. There is going to be a sponge fee or a metal fee on it. So if you, let's just say, had a $15 per ounce charge on palladium, and you had, let's say X amount of palladium, you just do the math to times it out.
But what I meant is, what is that fee? Like, if you could put it in simple terms, that sponge fee, not in dollar amounts, but what is that charge going to?
Okay. So basically, the metal sponge fee is the cost of the chemical transformation of recuperating the ounces in a given lot of converters. So, for example, if there were 10 ounces of platinum and the fee is $15 per ounce, there would be $150 of fees to recover or create the platinum metal ounces.
Thank you. The reason I wanted that description is because it's going to lead us into the next point to summarize our introduction. Is I'd like you both to give a brief, description of the difference between toll refining versus refining before we get into our main points.
Okay. Well, the notion of tolling is that we're actually delivering precious metal ounces based on a contract date. And the tolling comes from the knowledge, where that knowledge of the precious metal ounces are coming from. So in the process of toll refining, converters would be cut, crushed, sampled. That sample of a given load of converters is where this future tolling is happening. We know the value of that load of converters at the assay stage. The refining portion comes into play after smelting. So the only way to evaluate a given load of converters is sampling and assay. Then the ceramic is going to go and be smelted. And that smelting requires a smelter to run 24/7. And there's 2,500 pound bags of ceramic being pushed into the smelter all the time. So it's always running, and then the metals are being separated. Now, it's not just precious metals at that stage. It's actually all the metals that would have been in that ceramic, and there's going to be traces of iron and copper and tin and any number of things that go through the smelting process. 5% of what comes out of the smelter is metal. So there's no way to actually separate anybody's given load of converters that went in. This is where the refining stage happens. So once we've got the metals out of the smelter, they now need to be chemically separated or refined to become those precious metal ounces. So this is where the purification process is happening.
I think just to add, because tolling is a term in, let's say, a lot of our suppliers' realm, right? So if you're a scrapyard or a metal yard and you're running a lot of ferrous material, they can have that tolled through another company that's going to basically process the material and kind of essentially give it back to them. But in our world, we're doing the same thing, even though technically we'll still own the ounces to deliver, but it really is they are our suppliers' ounces. So that tolling process is really us doing the process of determining the value, figuring out the ounces, doing the whole process to get it to the next stage. But those ounces are really for our suppliers. So I think tolling is still the same way it is used in the scrap world.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you both for just providing that brief introduction on what is included in refining terms, as well as the stages of refining and a difference between toll versus.
I thought one more thing. Back to the contract term. I think Cliff said he hears about it a lot, but when does the actual contract start running? And I think that's a question that I get asked a lot of times from new people coming on board with us. For us, it's the day that it arrives at our facility. The clock starts of 1:15 working backwards. But I think if you're dealing with another company that might not be really doing it fully themselves, they might just decant the product, then sell it to another company, and the clock
where
starts.
that starts the clock at
maybe
that
30
point.
days after.
So
at
there's
that other
still
company.
another, there's a third party link
Yeah.
that the supplier may not necessarily be privy to who that is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or, they might do it on a 90, but if it starts 30 days after, that's 120, right? So
True.
I think it's always good for them to clarify when that starts for them.
And just while we're talking about terms and wrapping that up before we move on, every company seems to have a different term set. And so it's very confusing to catalytic converter sellers to compare term sets and
Don't get too ahead of yourself, because that's one of our talking points.
Excellent. So you know what, maybe we'll expand upon that as we go, because there's a lot of comparison points.
To move on from our was supposed to be short but longer introduction, we have a few discussion points that we want to go over today about the facts of refining. The first is barriers aren't what they once were to sell by the ounce or to sell by assay. There's more value selling by toll refining as a second discussion point. And our final discussion point, which I think Cliff was about to go into, but we need to save it, was not all refining terms are equal. So to begin the discussion, in terms of barriers aren't what they once were, does somebody want to introduce what we mean by that, as what were the barriers and what limitations did people have? Ryan?
Yeah, so obviously nowadays, a lot more companies have access to be able to get a refined value on their converters. But I think back in the day, I don't know, I guess we can call that different things, but it was generally large groupings of converters, right? So minimum of 1,000 units. That's what companies would need to have. It would take 45 to 60 days or longer to really get that assay back. And they were really just always dealing in truckloads, right? So if you had a truckload of converters, that definitely was 1,000 pieces, and you'd be able to get that. So most companies, most yards, even smaller auto wreckers, it was very hard for them to be able to access 1,000 converters. They might not wanted to hold it that long. Maybe they could do it once a year, but that really didn't help their business model. So for them, assay really wasn't an option.
Got it. And I think the other thing that we needed to discuss too was settlement days, right? Before, it used to be a lot longer to receive a settlement and payment versus now. That was another barrier.
Yeah. So the companies would say, well, one, why would I ship out my converters and wait 60 days for full payment where I can get a pretty fair price for what they thought picked up at my door, which kind of makes sense. But again, how do you know what that fair price was if you really haven't explored the refining part of it? And I also think when it comes to like resources and tools, there really 10, 15 years ago, there really wasn't any, right? So you're adding more scare to these yards because they're just hoping that they're going to get more, right?
Yeah, it's kind of blindly putting faith and like shipping out your material blindly and hoping to get a positive return. Whereas now, like there are tools and resources to help them feel more secure. For example, we internally have an inventory box program, right, where they can know their inventory before they ship out, an estimated value, and feel comfortable in knowing they have that sense of security, right? Cliff, do you have anything to add in terms of the barriers?
Well, I'm going to say, as far as barriers go, no, I think we kind of covered that notion that you had to have 1,000 units as a minimum. And I think one of the other barriers too in that is as we said, the risk or the not really understanding of what that means and when the material is being sold. So if you were holding material to wait for a great market and your core buyer came along and you got paid for that, that seemed to be one way of doing things. The next part of that equation ends up being, what were you selling your converters at in the market, from a total refining perspective? You have more control, but if the market changed and you're trying to compare one to the next, this can also be really, I would say, a barrier as well. Just the not understanding how the markets work and shape the price of your material.
For sure. And I would go a step further to say that, the barrier that we face today is people still believing in this need to accumulate big volumes and to deal direct and sell by assay, and that they don't have to, even people who are dealing in big volumes to turn them towards, shipping weekly instead of monthly, with such a volatile market. So I guess my question to end off this, discussion point would be, what are the disadvantages to people who are do not want to adapt and do not want to consider this new notion of, you can go direct, you can sell by assay, you don't need to sell per unit and have multiple people bidding and spending time and investing and having multiple people come to your yard. What is the disadvantage of staying comfortable in the sense of doing it the way that it's always been done?
Well, I've seen it and talked to a lot of owners that they find it, obviously there's a risk of trying it, right? What happens if it gets lost in transit? What happens if it doesn't make it over the border? We've heard it all. But what happens with if they try it and let's just say they got $5 more a piece, $10 more a piece, and then they go back for the years and years of transactions that they were dealing with the core buyer, they're also taking a risk there by losing a lot of money by not giving it a shot. So I think, the comfort level is there for them. Some of them will not want to change, but we see things happen. Their buyer might go out of business, right? Being a core buyer, and I know because I used to be one, over 10 years ago, it's not the easiest thing, right? Because you're paying a pretty good price and you're hoping for a good assay, right? So, there's times that the core buyers go out and they might pay more than what the loads are worth. But then once they obviously start losing a little bit of money, they have to dial it back down to make a profit. So I think a lot of the owners, I'd say the old school owners are comfortable in that way. But again, I think having a smaller lot size, and this is what we'll get into, to try 200-300 converters is better than saving up 1,000+ converters, and if it didn't work for them, it's less risk.
And I think in the past year, the kind of not silver lining, I would say maybe the something that hid this concept of, I have to save 1,000 is, when the market was on an upswing, when they were saving that 1,000 and shipping monthly, it was positive because the market was up. Whereas now it's not really the same type of market that we were in, right? So that does paint a different picture.
Well, I'm going to say one of the bigger disadvantages too is just really not understanding what you've got. So, whether you're saving up, a minimum of 1,000 pieces or you're liquidating them faster, either way, you don't have this true knowledge of what the core is valued at. You're reliant on somebody else
giving you that information,
right, at a given market, as opposed to truly understanding what's coming from your facility, being able to turn it faster. So the notion of adapting, if you can move that material quickly in similar markets that you're currently buying it, you have much more data to make good business decisions on a month-to-month basis as far as you're buying of vehicles up front or converters on those vehicles or converters themselves.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Brian. Moving on to our next discussion point, that being there's more value selling by toll refining. So you do not get more selling by the piece versus selling by assay, obviously with some exceptions to the rule. Who would like to elaborate on this beginning point?
I'll take a stab at this. Ultimately, converters are evaluated by toll refining and the precious metals that they contain, so that there are no two converters that have the same value. Despite having many databases that would evaluate converters by a serial number, that's still not the final vision of a converter. They still need to be toll refined. Now, anybody purchasing material by the piece needs to use a database and information to go out and buy them by the piece. They're at risk still, because that information is never going to be 100% accurate. And they have to make money in that process. They're not coming to buy your converters at a loss or a break even. They're there to make money. So there's going to be, depending on volume at your yard and what you're selling, there'll be a variety of different buyers that would come in and try and make money on the material they're buying from you. Now we're in a very competitive market these days, so the percentages may not be as big as they were 10 years ago, but there's still a percentage being left on the table. And ultimately, toll refining does pay more, and an experienced buyer that's going out to buy a given load of converters is going to hold that percentage for their own.
So in layman's terms, basically, if somebody is buying from you by the piece, they ultimately need to deal with somebody that processes the material by toll refining by assay. They essentially need to get to that point. So if they're essentially need to get to that point, there needs to be a reason, a profit behind it. So for sure, selling directly to somebody who's going to pay you based on the ounce, not on the unit, is going to return a higher value. Otherwise, people wouldn't be wanting to purchase by the unit.
Absolutely. And I mean, and the further you are away from the toll refining, the more often, the more times the converters are going to change hands before they get to a toll refiner, the more you're leaving on the table.
And there are those exceptions to the rules, right? Where a buyer will come in and say, I'll give you $500 for this piece. And that you have the pushback saying, well, this guy's going to give me $500 for that piece. What is your general discussion or, retort to sometimes suppliers asking you these questions or telling you these things? Well, I got a guy that's going to give me $500 for this piece, and, your system's showing me less than that.
Yeah, the first question I would answer or ask back is, what piece, like how often do you get that piece, right? Because usually the crazy high dollar values on a unit that you might have one or two in the load really doesn't make it a big idea. But what do you get on a regular domestic? What do you get on a pre-domestic, pre-foreign, very common converters that everyone's going to have, 10, 15, 20% or more of their load. So, that's that. And let's just say it's not one converter. Let's just say it was an average, right? They might pay X average, which sounds great, but one, how long are they doing that? And two, are you counting with them? Are they not manipulating the averages to make it seem like there's higher average than what that value actually dictates, right? So,
or turning around and asking them, okay, if I had a box of 100 of these units, would you still pay me $500 per unit, sort of thing?
And typically that answer would be absolutely not, because it's a lost leader in their price list. And ultimately, selling by toll refining is going to give the truer value of the material and essentially more, but without the smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, and I think just two other points is talking about why I think there's definitely more value in toll refining is like pooling ounces and hedging options, right? So when say a core buyer or a buyer comes to a yard, they're most likely going to pay them on a platinum palladium market of that day, or maybe last week if they locked in an order. But that yard and that owner is subject. He has to take that one price, right? So when you sell on refining, you're more in control, right? Because if there's going to be days that platinum and palladium sky up and rhodium goes down, and they might not want to lock in the rhodium that day. So, you have options of maybe just doing 1-2 metals at a time, doing a percentage, or if the market just is, you bought converters for the last 30 days and it just jumped up $20 a piece, some people gamble a little bit, right? And they might want to ride that out for the 2 weeks that it might take to process and get the assay back. So the owners that like to be in control, once they get a feel of it and they're actually making decisions on selling and hedging, they like that. And I think when it comes to LTL options, that really wasn't an idea, 10 years ago, right? So someone in the middle of nowhere in a state that's just, not a lot of people would even drive out there to buy 100 converters or 200 converters. They could now ship it by LTL, which is a fairly reasonable price. And it could be $500, but if that box is worth $20,000, it's really not a lot. So I think, when I came into PMR and, years ago, and we, just dealing in states and provinces that I thought we would never really have access to, but it still makes sense just because of the value of a box or multiple boxes. So I think LTL is a really good option that really wasn't there before.
Absolutely. And it even made sense. And while we have converter prices that are ranging in all-time highs, it even made sense 5 years ago to ship LTL when, the averages were, 20% of what they are today.
Yeah. So just to provide a brief recap of what you both said, the advantages and the more value by selling by toll refining is you're knowing the true return of your material. You're getting more value because you're getting that true return. It's understanding your material and having the option and authority to make decisions based on how you're going to get paid or for that material, or essentially pool your ounces if you decide to do that. Which brings us to our last discussion point, which is not all refining terms are equal. So margins are tight industry-wide. Even though terms may look more appealing, most of the time people are looking at that metal percentage return, right? It's not necessarily the only factor. As we discussed at the beginning in the introduction, there are so many different factors that go into a terms agreement, right? And a lot of people just look at that metal percentage return. So Cliff, do you want to start us off, as because you went into that before? What do we mean when we say not all refining terms are equal?
Well, it comes down to where the fees start to come out of the material. So, if we take a term that is a 97% return of platinum and a 97% return of palladium and 90 of rhodium, the next question in evaluating this is what fees are associated with it. So we talk about we talk about processing fees. So those processing fees are often determined by a per pound of ceramic processed. And so sometimes they're 75 cents. I've seen them range up into $1.50 or different ranges. So that's one place to start looking. Then we look at decanting fees, because they're not always tied together. So some companies charge an additional 50 cents a unit just to decant the converters. We can go into what are the interest rates based on selling that material and when you're getting paid for it within a contract. How long is the contract? Is it 90 days? Is it 120 days? Is there
150 days? Yeah. So it's essentially what you're saying is you can't only look at what the metal percentage return is. You need to be looking at all other factors within your terms agreement. And if you're not, you're at a disadvantage right now because you're not seeing things as transparent as you think they are.
Right. And even more, I'm going to say fuel to the fire. How is your metal being sold and priced? So where are those, when you sell an ounce of platinum or palladium, what market is it being sold at? Under what contract is it being sold on? And even further into that, what reductions are coming from that metal price? Is your lease rate transparent within the metal price, or is it being taken in combination with an interest rate? Because these are often things that I see from other companies' terms, where these are blended rates that I think can be very confusing to somebody that's trying to compare one term to the next, and without actually having real clarification on it. Once again, can be just as confusing as why somebody pays more for a single converter.
For sure. And I think that other, what we see commonly is little transparency in terms of the prices that they're actually giving, because they'll record a price, but not, like you said, incorporate those lease rates in there. So somebody at face value, just looking at something quickly, might think, oh, I'm getting X price. But really, once they get their results, once they get their terms back, they see that there's reduction. If they don't go in and actually look at them, there are reductions being made off that price that they thought they were getting, right? Ryan, do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Well, I kind of had something else to just talk about when it comes to refining terms, is like the all-inclusive refining term, right? Because we have that as well. So I think a lot of people that are getting an all-inclusive, they're not seeing the fees. Obviously, there's going to be a lower metal return, but people still don't understand how to compare the two. So someone would say to me, is like, wow, the 92.90 with no, they wouldn't say with no fees, but 92.90, that's a really low term. Like I'm getting offered 94 or 95%. So then I would say to them, but what are your fees? And when they would give it to me, I would say, well, actually the 92s are higher because I know the fees and I know the structure of how it works. So I think the first thing, because usually one of the first headers, right, or the first paragraphs is 90 whatever percent. So they're really not looking through the whole agreement and comparing the two. So I think you have to really understand that there is an all-inclusive terms, and there are ones that show all the fees. Some people want to see the fees, some people don't, because they just want it to be a little bit more simple. So I think you got to really understand that you could see two different options.
And I think, just to build upon your point, it's not just the terms that you need to be looking at when you're evaluating a partner, right? It's the whole package, the whole size. How is the support? How are the tools? What, are you being consulted in a very transparent and educative way when you're dealing with somebody? Right. So it's not just terms sometimes. Sometimes it's a whole package in terms of what you're being offered.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as we're evaluating terms, and from our side of the coin, we see it very clearly because, we're offering terms, we understand terms.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say to anybody who's considering moving towards a toll refining solution within their own organization, as you're evaluating partners to toll refine, and as Kristen's mentioning, what services do they offer? What kind of information are they offering?
Customer support. How consultative
is their approach? So I like to, as an account manager, make sure that I'm offering that consultative approach. So if there's a question about this, company A, B, or C, and what those terms mean, by all means, they should ask us, and they should ask the other companies what this is or what that is, and how does it compare. Yeah. I think there's a real fair way of having those conversations and shedding some light on this, because really, the truth is what the consumer deserves, and just asking the questions, I think, is really important. And if you're coming up against a company that stutters and stammers over what their terms mean, you might want to look somewhere else for something that's truly open.
Yeah, and if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it well enough, right? And when you're trying to get information from somebody who can explain things simply to you, you're not in the right place to get the correct information. So to end off this discussion point, and I think it might be a little hard question to answer, so I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball here, but considering the fact that no converter lives the same life, no lot of material will ever be identical. How do you properly compare and evaluate apples with apples when you're trying to decipher between a partner in toll refining?
Are you talking about in the whole equation of the package, or just the terms, or
I guess both. In terms of the terms, it would be a little simpler, right? Because you really need to know, okay, what are the factors that I need to be considering, and is there proper information for each of these terms, right? Whereas if you're trying to compare apples and apples with a specific lot, I think that's a little more difficult, right? Because you will never be able to send an identical lot to two different processors.
For sure. Well, I would say if you're dealing with a large toll refiner or processor, their terms netted are going to be very similar, right? If they're fees, not fees, there really should be within a percent or two, and sometimes they should be pretty equal. So I think once you receive two similar terms of what you think are pretty fair, then you really have to send them a few loads of a similar sample size or quantity, and really just evaluate it after that point, right? So if you sold 4 loads or 5 loads to one company, you gotta sell it to the other company, and really
work on
averages, but really taking everything into consideration. Let's just say that was a 6-month period that you split your product right in half, because we've had companies do that. They were honest with us. Hey, I'm splitting it right in half, and I'm gonna 6 months sell to you to get a good monthly return, sell it to the company I'm currently selling to, and our thing is great. Just you should be able to figure out for yourself after that what's the better route.
Granted, the market is relatively the same in those 6 months, right?
But even that market can be taken out of the equation if you're getting true and accurate reports back on the material. Sure. Yeah. So I think Ryan really nails it in saying history is the key, and having enough material and enough history from comparative toll refiners,
Yeah.
is one part of the equation. And I think Kristen was really alluding to the other part. So Ryan, and to your point, if everybody out in the market these days as a real toll refiner is within 1 or 2% of each other,
Yeah.
and that's going to go load to load, plus and minus, because everything's going to be not equal. So, I guess really drive the point home, what is your partner giving you in addition to terms? Are you getting information about converters? Are you getting information on how to buy them? What's in them? Do you have resources that are available from the company that you're working with to do pre-evaluations of that material, to how to buy it, whether it's in a car, prior to actually seeing the converter, or what kind of tools do you have to evaluate converters coming through your door if you're buying them from the public?
And once they're processed, like Ryan was saying, like having the correct data and having somebody who's able to readily supply you with that data,
Well, I've said it out pretty bluntly. Someone came back and said, "Hey, your terms are the exact same of what I'm getting, so why would I switch to you?" And I said, "Well, what kind of volume you're doing?" And they would tell me. And I said, "How long have you been working with them for?" 10 years. Well, to me, if your volume hasn't grown at all, right, I think after working with us, even if we paid you 1% less on the terms and we tripled or quadrupled your volume, you would still want to take that deal. And I'm not saying we would pay you less, but the point is, if we have doubled, tripled, quadrupled companies' volumes within X amount of time frame, and for them, that is more profit for them. Right, so that's important to understand.
Well, and even that pre-evaluation, as you say, Ryan, what's really going to increase volume? It's that knowledge of the product as you're bringing it through your door, not as it's going out to the toll refiner. Yeah. I mean, all things are equal. We're going to say as a general rule between the top toll refiners in the market today. Maybe I'm a little bit biased, but not all things are equal on the front end and understanding the value of the material as it's coming into you.
Yeah.
And the speed at which it turns too. So while the back end of the terms are important to evaluate, how fast is it being done? Are you able to get true assay reports of just your material in less than 30 days, less than 60? How about this? Why not get them in 10 business days?
Yeah.
And if that's happening for you and you're able to understand your material in the same month you shipped it out, once again, most companies see that as a huge benefit, especially with volatile markets, when you would be able to finalize larger loads in that relatively similar or volatile market.
Yeah, I agree. I think people got to really get away from the averages to some point, because if you're shipping the same load that receives at 2 different companies on the first of the month, and one company does it in 2 weeks and one does it in 45 days, well, depending on where you actually settled and hedged that material, it could be good for the one company versus the other, right? But the point is like, if you're shipping the 500 converters and you have 1,000 pounds of product, how many ounces are coming out of that, right? Like you really need to take the next step at really looking at the data and not just looking at the averages.
So as a concluding statement, I guess it's, if you want to scale converter revenue down the line, you need to be looking at selling by the ounce, selling by assay, working with somebody who can consult, educate, not just give you, tell you a price, but really give you historical data based on your material. And that's the concluding sentiment that I think we all have. But just to end with some final questions, I'm going to ask you both, what reservations do you encounter with people, or what reservations do they have about refining? So Cliff, Ryan, just one response for both of you.
I'm going to say most people that are first transferring to toll refining are scared of losing money. And they're scared that they're going to get ripped off. I'm going to say that as a toll refiner, this is not how we built our business. In fact, we built our business in making sure that people get paid correctly for their material, quickly for their material, in a secure and transparent way.
And we're interested in building partnerships, getting to lot 100, not just getting lot 1, right? So Ryan, what would you say, what reservations do people have about it?
Yeah, obviously Cliff nailed the main one, but I think people, I've heard it a lot of times that they've tried it before and it didn't work for them. So they have tried it. And it could be a couple of reasons, right? Did you even deal with a direct toll refiner, or did you deal with someone else that was then selling to them and you didn't really get the whole understanding and package?
So a lack of true understanding.
And I would say to them, like, that's fine, right? But have you just haven't found the right assay company to really deal with. So I think trying to get people out of their comfort zone is only going to happen at mitigating the risk, right? So
that brings me to my last and final question from both of you, and I'll start with Ryan since you've already came into the topic. How do you get people out of their comfort zones?
So obviously you reduce the minimum lot size, because a company might take them 12 months to really gain 1,000 converters, and they don't want to do that. So if they're comfortable maybe selling 200, 300, that's going to be a lot easier for them, because they could even sell a little bit to who they're dealing with and toll refine the rest. So I think doing that, obviously working with a company that's got insurance on the trucking side, and making sure that they feel comfortable about their load going wherever it is. And then obviously just some evaluation tools or resources before they ship, right? So maybe they use a program that would evaluate their converters or give them some sort of number instead of just shipping blind. Because I think that's the main thing. In the past, they're so used to, oh, you have to deal with me, but just ship me my converters, and 30, 45 days later, I'll tell you what it's worth. That doesn't work for people these days.
Yeah, I agree. Cliff, how do you get people out of their comfort zones?
Well, I'm going to say sometimes it's just a leap of faith.
True.
And you have to do something different to get something different. But beyond that, asking for references. So
yeah, that's a good one.
It's a very small world. I'm going to say the converter world, and people who actually deal with it at our level and who would sell to us. It's not that hard to track somebody down that's one of your peers and ask for a reference.
Yeah, because everyone, like, it doesn't matter if you're not a recycler or a scrapyard. Like, you're either involved with ISRI or ARA or your own state association. You're part of some group, and you know who the big players are in terms of the larger companies that have volume, that are probably 95% of the time dealing on assay. So just go ask them, right? Say, hey, you know what? You don't have to ask where you're selling to if they don't want to give that, but you can say, what's your experience with refining? Do you even refine? Do you sell by piece? So I think those yards, because they have really good relationships with everyone in their organization. Just
start from your own network and then build out. Start getting some information, knowledge from the guys that you trust most and that you work with all the time. Yeah. All right, so thank you guys for being part of our Blue Table Talk today, and we look forward to the next conversation.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you guys.
Thanks. Bye.